Hey all, Brian Sterling here, coming to you from my home office here in Dallas, Texas. Apologize for the lo-fi presentation with the mic and cam and everything, but I just wanted to take a moment to kind of review week one, specifically the discussion board and the content about the theological method. I think it's important that we nail it down, not just because it's helpful in your Christian education and your budding future as theologians, as trying to understand how God relates to the world, but also practically because it's going to come up in weeks 4 and 8 on the two papers you have to write for the class. Once in a small paper on the image of God, and once in a big paper in week 8 where you'll pick a subject of theology that you want to cover, and you're going to have to go through each individual step in the theological method and kind of explain yourself. So it's important to get down now. Again, I want to just review the discussion, review the steps, and kind of get my thoughts on the matter. Just how I process things might be differently. Dr. Small has an excellent video that I sincerely hope you've all watched already in Module 1 explaining the 5 steps, and he does a great job. But again, this is just a supplement. This is something bonus if you have spare time, if you want to if you want to understand it better or just at least differently, then this is for you. I might be a little bit long-winded at times, and for that I apologize. I love talking about this. So again, this is kind of bonus review. So let's get to it. The discussion board in week 1, you could have probably handled it one of two ways. You could have used the 5 steps that Dr. Small talks about in his video, or you can go to the textbook, to Aiken, and he uses 4 steps to doing theology. I love Aiken's steps. They're easy to remember. They're kind of conversational, just in question format, very Socratic method almost. And it makes it, again, easier to talk to people like in church or just one student to another, just how to do theology. What does the Bible say? What has the church believed on this topic? How do we put it all together so that it makes sense? And what does it matter? What is the point? What do we do with it once we get that down? So those 4 points are very, again, helpful, very easy to remember. If that's the way you took it on the discussion board, great. I do want to focus on the 5 points from Dr. Small's video, because those are the points that are going to come up in the paper or papers later in the class. So let's kind of just walk through them one by one. There are 5 steps. First one is philosophical presupposition. Those are really big words. Presupposition. It's a supposition, something you assume, something you believe beforehand. So when we're talking about a theological topic, when you have a presupposition, it's something you already hold to be true before you even approach a topic. And depending on your presuppositions, you might come to different conclusions later down the line. That's why it's important to search yourself, to recognize what you bring to the table before you even start, essentially. For instance, if you're talking about miracles in the Bible, if you come from a place where God does not involve himself in creation and miracles are impossible, anytime you come to Scripture and you see a miracle, like Thomas Jefferson did, you might rip it out and say that's an addition, that's not possible, because you come with this preconceived notion that God does not involve himself in creation. That is a presupposition that you bring to a study of theology. So these can kind of be big ideas or really tiny ones. That the fact that God exists, the fact that he is involved in creation, that he can communicate to us, that we can understand what he wants in our lives, that he is actively involved in every aspect of our lives. These are all kind of ideas that you might bring to a topic like, again, miracles or church service or things like that. You have to examine yourself and say, okay, what are these things that I already believe over here that are informing the rest of my theological pursuits? And so these presuppositions are always going to be changing the more you study, hopefully changing. The more you study Scripture, The more you study history, the more you study theology, you might come back and say, oh, that thing I believed when I was 12, when I was 17, when I was 30, wherever you are, uh, has a little bit more to it. Maybe it was wrong. Maybe you, again, can add to it. Maybe you can firm it up as foundation. So your presuppositions should be changing, but they should be addressed before you continue with the additional steps. Step 2 is, what does the Bible say? The biblical evaluation. This is where you actually look at verses, you look at words, you look at topics, you look at chapters. And I think this is the part where most people in the church, most people in this class, I would assume, this is the part you're most comfortable with, you're most familiar with. If you've been in a church for any length of time, even if you're a new believer, odds are you were walked through scriptures to get where you are today. So opening up the Word and having to do a discussion on the image of God, you would start with Genesis 1:26 and 27. You would start with Genesis 9:6, and then you would further unpack that. And so biblical evaluation can be small, like I said, words, verses, or you can get bigger. What does this chapter of Ephesians say? How does it fit into Paul's overall thought? How does this conform to the rest of the New Testament writers? How does this represent it in all of Scripture? So biblical evaluation, again, I think is the thing we do most in Sunday school and in church, and just opening up the Word and reading what it says. And now, because of presuppositions, because of your theology that exists already, you might have different interpretations on that scripture. And this is the step to kind of hash it out and see what different ideas might be. Okay, not everybody has the same idea on, say, sign gifts when you go to 1 Corinthians 14. Some people have different interpretations. And so let's do the steps of the method. Let's go to the scripture and see what it says. Now, here's a caveat. Unfortunately, a lot of us stop here. And I think that is a pitfall that we have in class and in discussion and how we talk on the board. And we think, all I have to do is pull out a scripture and that'll fix things. Well, because John 3:16 says this, then the matter is settled. But again, people have different interpretations. They come at it from different backgrounds. And that's why it's important that we do these steps and that we do them constantly in a cycle. So let's move on. Step 3 is the historical considerations. What have believers in the past already concluded about, let's say, this topic or this passage? I'm going to speak for myself here. I don't know about you guys, but I think people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Athanasius, Anselm, Augustine, they've done a lot more work than I have. They're a lot wiser, more practiced than I perhaps will ever be. So I'm going to defer to them on a lot of topics. And so when we do this historical consideration, when we look at the train of Christian thought over 2,000 years, we can avoid some mistakes in interpretation. We can avoid certain heresies, if you will, in the past, and help inform our current theology. They've done a lot of the heavy lifting for us, these church fathers, these reformers, things like that. They've done a lot of the hard work of synthesizing, of investigating scripture, of collecting all the verses as best they know how to do. And so it makes our life easier to kind of stand on their shoulders and see, what have they said? What have they done already? Help me better understand. You can either come alongside their ideas, you can challenge their ideas, but it's interesting to see where people have already come from. Too many times nowadays, I see budding theologians come out and say, I have a new solution to this problem plaguing the church. And it turns out it was something that was addressed in 400 AD. And so rather than wasting our time, rather than trying to figure things out all our own, we can look at history, and you can look at individual scholars. You can look at time periods of history, the apostolic age, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the medieval period. There are, again, trains of thought that are important to study that make our process a whole lot easier. And so we have analyzed our presuppositions, the things we already bring to the topic at hand. We've looked at Scripture. What does it say? And what are varying interpretations of that Scripture? And now we look at history. How have other people answered these questions already? And once we've done all three of those steps, now we get to theological construction. This is where we take everything we just talked about and try to put it in a neat, convenient package that helps to, again, understand how God relates to the world and everything that goes with it. These are the big concepts you might be familiar with already, where you have Calvinism and Arminianism. These are theological constructions that are taking all of Scripture and trying to make sense of God's sovereignty and human freedom and how those relate. Well, here is one method of understanding that relationship, and here is a slightly different method of understanding that relationship. Both looking at Scripture, both trying to be very honest and very genuine in interpreting what God has meant in His Word, and trying to communicate that in as neat and as convenient of a way as possible. Other examples that even Dr. Small gave are relate to millennialism, where Revelation 20 says that Satan will be bound and Jesus will reign on earth for 1,000 years. And now, depending on if you take that term literally or figuratively, you can have this theological construction over here of premillennialism, that Jesus will return and reign on earth for that period of time. If you take that, again, figuratively, you have over here amillennialism, that there's no literal millennium. Jesus is reigning in here, right now. He has already returned. He has already conquered in our hearts. And those are, again, two theological camps. So specifically talking about the papers you're going to do, a lot of people stumble when it comes to theological construction because it is challenging. It is something you might not be familiar with doing on your own. You may have grown up a Calvinist. You may have grown up an amillennialist. You may be post-trib rapture. You know, these are all big concepts that have already assumed all these steps are done, but you don't know how you've gotten there. And this is a good way to see how we get there. So when you're writing the paper, you're going to want to take these big concepts and evaluate them. Again, say you are doing your paper, your final paper on the millennium, on end times specifically. And so when you're getting to the theological construction part, you're going to say, okay, here's the proposed solution to the problem. You have premillennialists. This is what they presuppose. This is the Scripture that they lean on, and this is how they interpret it. And these are the people throughout history who have weighed in on this subject and agreed. You have Augustine over here and Calvin over here, and you can even, again, go modern. You can go Charles Ryrie or George Ladd or Millard Erickson or Dwight Pentecost. You know, these are people who have weighed in. These are big names who have weighed in on these theologies. So you're going to do all the steps and try to present it in neat little packages. Sometimes you have two competing ideas. Sometimes it's three. Not often are you going to find too many more than that. But so that's the theological construction you're going to do in the paper. And then the final step, the fifth step, is the practical application. You know, what does this all matter? And that's an extremely, extremely important step, because it doesn't matter if you can spell presupposition backwards. If you know how to define infralapsarianism, which you're probably going to have to define around week 4 or 5 in this class. But just knowing the term and defining it, what does it matter unless you are actually applying it to your Christian walk, unless you are using it to inform yourself as a child of God and how you can better be an evangelist, how you can better be a son or daughter, how you can be a better pastor, whatever it might be. Unless you are applying it, then there's no point in learning all this. I mean, James 2 says even the demons believe truths about God, and that they tremble. It strikes them with fear that they believe it. They understand it so well. Does it inform their behavior? No. So as a result, again, I think the practical application is super important that we cannot ignore it. And so this is going to be a big feature of your your paper in week 4 on the image of God. Again, it's a shorter paper, but you're going to want to do the first few steps of the theological method and say, okay, these are the verses. I already kind of gave you the verses in the beginning. This is what people have interpreted. These are some ideas throughout history, how people have weighed in. Again, the way Irenaeus interprets the image and likeness of God is slightly different from, say, Calvin or Karl Barth. So you're going to want to just touch on that a little bit in the first half. And then the second half is all practical application. How does what you just discussed affect your vocation? The thing you're going to do with your degree, ideally. If you believe people are made in the image of God, then you should probably respect them, treat them more highly than somebody you might think is not created in God's image. And it's going to be dependent on how you defined it in the first half. Is God's image relational? Is it our capacity to relate to other people? If so, then you would value relationships in the workplace. Is it related to your intellect, your emotions, your will? Is it that's something that God does? Is that what it is in us? Well, then you're going to reflect it on how you think and how you feel. It should be in line with how God thinks and feels about other people. Again, and this should all be related to the workplace in this particular paper. So again, I wanted to get these steps down. I wanted to nail them down in your mind, not only because it helps in the practical Christianity, just again, day-to-day conversations with other believers, with pastors, with people that might be underneath you, how best to understand things about God, about the universe, about morality, about all these kinds of things, but also because it's going to come up in 2 papers we're going to do, not to mention this first discussion. So again, let's review 5 steps. Philosophical presupposition, biblical evaluation, historical consideration, theological construction, and practical application. Every one of these steps should constantly be informing the rest of the steps. You can zigzag and jump in between them, but all of them should be in process at all times when doing theology. Everyone is a theologian. I hate to break it to you. You might not have felt that way before. You might not have had any interest in theology whatsoever. But whether you realize it or not, you do have a concept of God. You do have a concept of whether science and faith are compatible. You do have an answer to that. Whether or not truth can be known, whether there is objective truth, how people should be treated, what is morality. You have these ideas in you, whether or not you've examined them or done this process before so specifically, that remains to be seen. But it's very important, again, that we get these concepts down. And if you want to go Aiken's route and remember the 4 questions instead, that's great. That's perfect. But for the purpose of our papers, we're kind of going to need to focus on these 5 steps once again. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, comments on the video, if you have anything else you want to ask, always text me, call me, email me, anytime you want to reach out. I'm here for you guys. Hopefully this helps, and hopefully we can do this again in other modules. All right? Thanks very much for listening and watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you guys.